Hey everybody, how's it going? I hope you're all doing well. I just want to let you know I had an opportunity to get through the first couple of modules worth of guided notes, and I've enjoyed reading those as well as taking a look at your discussion board posts. And just wanted to take a moment to clarify a couple of things that can tend to be confusing. One has to do with those requirements for becoming a BCBA. Thank you to all of you for outlining what your game plan is. Most of you are planning on going ahead and pursuing BCBA certification. Just a couple of things that I wanted to make sure that we're clear about that. One is as far as the collection of hours. Okay, so in order to begin collecting hours, number one, you have to have a supervisor identified who has basically agreed to be your supervisor, and you've entered into a contract with that person. So obviously they know they're providing the supervision. They're documenting along with you every single time that they're supervising you. You are completing your hours log every day, and your supervisor is filling out the monthly verification forms for you. So that's critical that you've got a supervisor. And the second thing is that you can't begin collecting hours until you've begun behavior analytic coursework. So obviously, if you're doing hours now, that's not a problem. You're in this course. You're doing behavior analytic coursework. But just a reminder for any of you who were planning on counting hours from before this course began, if you've taken behavior analytic coursework in the past, that's fine. You can do that if you're using that previous coursework to count towards the coursework requirements to sit for the exam. But if this is your first behavior analytic coursework, or if you previously took 80/50 earlier in the semester, if that was your first course, that's when you can start collecting hours. I just wanted to make sure to clarify that so there wasn't any confusion. And then again, for the vast majority of you, the number of hours that you're going to need over the course of your experience is 2,000 hours of supervised field work, 5% of which has to be directly supervised by your BCBA supervisor, okay? Just wanted to make sure that was clear. And please, if you have any questions, if you're not sure about what your requirements are or where you stand in the process, and if your supervisor isn't sure, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm very happy to try to help you problem solve and work through that to make sure that you're doing all the things you need to do to be able to sit for the exam, okay? Second thing that I wanted to talk about really quickly is sort of that distinction between operant conditioning and respondent conditioning. Areas where people tend to get tripped up with that is sometimes people make the assumption that if we're talking about animals, it's probably respondent conditioning, or people tend to think, oh, if we're talking about food, it's respondent conditioning. That may be the case, but it's not as simple as that, and that's not really where the distinction lies. The distinction between operant and respondent really lies in whether the behavior is evoked or elicited, right? And behavior that's evoked means that the organism, whether it's an animal or whether it's a person, has some control over whether they engage in that behavior, and the behavior is selected by the consequence that follows that behavior. Whereas behavior that's elicited is behavior that the organism does not have any control over whether it's going to engage in. It's a reflex, okay? And those behaviors are controlled by the antecedents, by the things that come before it, okay? So a couple of examples that came up in your guided notes that are worth talking about and I think are interesting. One is sort of that example of, some of you mentioned, okay, well, I've got a pet and I'm gonna feed my pet. So there are a couple of things that might happen when you set about feeding your pet. One is, right, you might open the cabinet or use the can opener or whatever that's going to release your pet's food, right, that you're then going to deliver, and your pet comes running over at the sound of the cabinet opening or the can opener going, right. Your pet coming running over, that's operant conditioning. Okay, because your pet has a choice to make. Your pet could choose to run over or could choose not to run over, okay? But it's within the pet's control. And the reason your pet comes running over is because in the past, the sound of the can opener, when the pet comes running over, it's been followed by the delivery of the food, okay? So it's maintained by the consequence there. The behavior is evoked, so it's operant conditioning. Whereas at the sound of the can opener or the cabinet door opening, if your pet starts salivating, that's not within your pet's control, okay? It's a reflex, okay? It's a reflex that was previously controlled by the presence of the food. Now it's controlled by the sound of the can opener or by the sound of the cabinet door opening, okay? It's a reflex. It's elicited. The animal can't control whether it happens. That's respondent conditioning. Another kind of similar example is the dog that might have the shock collar on, right? That sort of delineates the edge of the property. And that shock collar, it tends to be paired with a beep, right? So the dog approaches the edge of the property, a beep goes off, and if the dog doesn't move away from the property, a shock is then delivered a couple of seconds later, right, to teach the dog to stay away from the edge of the property, okay? So what we have here is the dog approaches the edge of the property and the beep goes off and the dog runs away from the edge of the property. Okay, the dog running away from the edge of the property, that's operant conditioning again, okay, because there's that stimulus that's discriminated, that discriminative stimulus for punishment, right? The tone basically signals, hey, if you don't get away from the edge of the property, a shock is coming, right? But the dog chooses to come away from the edge of the property. It's within the dog's control whether it chooses to move away from the edge of the property. It is evoked, okay? But now let's say that what's happening is the dog approaches the edge of the property, the tone goes off, and the tone has been followed by the electric shock. So at the sound of the tone, the dog flinches, okay, or the dog starts shaking, okay? That's not within the dog's control, whether it flinches or whether it starts shaking. So that behavior is reflexive, it is elicited, it's respondent behavior, okay? So again, the real distinction there is it controlled by what comes before it or controlled by what comes after it? And is the behavior a reflex or not? If the behavior is a reflex, it's respondent conditioning. If the behavior is not a reflex, if it's within the animal's control or the person's control, whether it engages in that behavior, then it's operant conditioning, okay? So that's the real distinction between the two there, which I know is super tricky, but it's an important concept to get down. The one last thing that I wanted to talk about really briefly is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, okay? Just making sure that everyone has a really clear understanding that anytime we're talking about reinforcement, okay, what we're talking about is some behavior is taking place, there's some kind of a stimulus change in the environment, either something's added or something's removed, and as a result, in the future, whatever behavior was occurring before that stimulus change increases, okay? Anytime we use the word reinforcement, we're always talking about future likelihood of behavior increasing, okay? The positive and the negative refers to that stimulus change in the environment. Was something added to the environment or was something removed from the environment, okay? So some response happens and then something is added to the environment and behavior goes up in the future. That's positive reinforcement. Okay, a student approaches me, and I sort of get in the student's way, and don't let them through a doorway that they're trying to get through, and they say, "Excuse me," and I say, "Nice job." If saying nice job increases the student saying excuse me in the future, that's positive reinforcement, right? Because what was delivered was me saying nice job, something was added to the environment, and as a result, the student saying excuse me increases. What's much more likely to be reinforcing in that same situation, the student approaches me as I'm standing in front of the door, and the student says excuse me, and I move, I get out of the way so the student can go through the door. okay? And now the student's more likely to say, excuse me, in the future. What's happened there is negative reinforcement, okay? Because the student approached me, I was the stimulus, the aversive stimulus in the environment, denying the student access to get through that door. The student says, excuse me, and the aversive stimulus, which is me, is removed. I step aside so the student can go through. That's negative reinforcement, okay? So when we're talking about negative reinforcement, behavior always increases following negative reinforcement, right? Future instances of that behavior increases because some aversive stimulus that was present in the environment is removed, okay? A couple of finer points about reinforcement as well, okay, is that it's always the behavior that occurs right prior to the stimulus change. That's what ends up getting reinforced, okay? The stimulus that was present immediately prior, and there has to be that stimulus change in the environment right after the behavior happens, okay? It can't be some stimulus change that happens an hour later or a week later or at the end of the semester in the case of grades, right? Those things, that's something different. That's rule-governed behavior that we'll get into. When we're talking about reinforcement, there's a behavior, there's a stimulus change right after the behavior occurs. And as a result, in the future, that same behavior happens more, okay? The positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement refers to was something added to the environment or removed from the environment, okay? Doesn't have to do with whether the behavior in question was quote unquote good or bad, whatever that means. It's not about whether the behavior was desired or undesired. It's with reinforcement, the behavior always happens more in the future, even if we didn't want it to. And the question is, was something added to the environment or removed from the environment? So I hope that helps to clear up a little bit. Number one, the requirements for sitting for the exam to become a BCBA. Number two, the difference between operant and respondent conditioning. And number three, some of those finer points about reinforcement, especially negative reinforcement. But please, if any of this seems unclear to you, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I'm happy to talk more with you about it. Thanks a lot, and I will talk with you soon.